Hey everybody, happy Friday! I'm so excited because it's Friday for start. Second of all, this is 5 days in a row with this daily language diary series. So thank you all for being a part of it. And I didn't actually tell you, but this has been probably the most stressful and difficult week at work ever since I started my current job. And so I feel pretty proud of putting 5 videos out this week, even in the most difficult week. But also I want to tell you that seeing all of your comments come in every day, sort of throughout the day, has been so helpful. So it makes me smile so much when people say like how much they like the series or how they really like today's video topic. It's been really lovely. So cheers to all of you. All right, so today's question of the day comes from Trilingual Lynn, who asks, do you have any tips on how to read in a foreign alphabet faster or more efficiently? I've started to read books in Chinese, but I wonder if you would know some exercises that could help me out with this. Well, thank you for your question, Trilingual Lynn, and I'll be happy to give it my best shot on today's daily language diary. Now, there are 2 parts to this question: reading a foreign alphabet, and so, for example, the Cyrillic alphabet if you're learning Russian, and those alphabets are going to usually be composed of a very small number of letters. Each letter represents a sound, and you just compose all the words of that language using different combinations of those small number of letters. Whereas in the other case, we have Chinese characters, and Trilingual Lynn, you mentioned reading in Chinese in your question. So that is a vastly more complex question, and that's where I'd like to spend more time. So I'll quickly say that for reading Cyrillic, for example, if you're an English speaker or any foreign alphabet like that, I think the 2 pieces of advice I'll give you are writing by hand, and I'll elaborate why that's so important in part 2 about Chinese characters, and just reading a lot. I honestly think that's really the 2 big things that you need to do. Writing by hand will really help you to sort of become more attentive and aware of the shapes that make up those letters, and it will train you to process them more quickly. But after that, I think that just reading a lot is going to be one of the most helpful things. But now with Chinese characters, I have a lot to tell you. So character sets are really different because each character is going to have a meaning behind it for a start, and then they also can have multiple meanings depending on the context, and they can also have multiple pronunciations depending on the context. In my experience learning Chinese, and in this case it's going to be hanzi, I find that the characters are more numerous, so there are more of them that you may need to learn, but they are also more stable. So my experience has been that most characters seem to have one general sort of family of meanings and one way to pronounce them. Now, there are some characters that will have multiple ways to pronounce them, but it seems like that is less frequent in Chinese. Whereas in Japanese, it's quite different. There are less characters that you need to know, but every single character basically has at least 2 pronunciations, because in the case of Japanese, those characters were imported from the Chinese language, and with them came a lot of loan words. So in Japanese, there's what's called kunyomi and onyomi, so the Chinese pronunciation and the Japanese pronunciation. However, a lot of characters are going to have 3 or 4, sometimes even 5 different ways to pronounce them, and they're going to have quite a lot of meanings. And so, like I said, they're fundamentally different than alphabets because they are vastly more numerous and they work based on sort of meaning, and you can have many different characters that have the same way to pronounce them. These languages also tend to have a lot of homonyms, so words that have the same pronunciation but totally different meanings. So cool. How do we go about learning to read more quickly and more efficiently in languages that use Chinese characters? Well, the first piece of advice I have is the same as before. Writing by hand is so critical, in my opinion, in learning Chinese characters. Now, really quickly, I actually taught languages for quite a long time. I taught in multiple different contexts, in different schools. I also was an intern at a French immersion school, and I taught the 5th grade, all in French. But I also ran my own business for 3.5 years where I was teaching languages online to people all over the world, both individuals and small groups. And Japanese is actually the language I have taught more than any other. And I tell you this because the students who really embraced my advice to write by hand, in every single case, learned so much more quickly than the students who refused to write Chinese characters by hand. It's very interesting, and I would be very curious to see the thoughts that you have if anyone has experience learning or teaching Japanese or Chinese. But that has always been my experience. And in my case, I learned like 2,000 Chinese characters in about 1.5 years, although I learned about 1,800 of those in a year. And that was extremely quick compared to how fast most people learn to read Chinese characters. And a really big part of how I managed to learn them so quickly was I did a lot of handwriting. So I'm going to quickly tell you why this is especially important with Chinese characters, but then I'm also going to tie that into my second piece of advice, which I think is quite uncommon, at least from what I have seen. So with Chinese characters, they're quite different in complexity. So some characters are going to be very simple with very few strokes. Some characters are going to be a lot more complex, but they are all composed of quite simple pieces. So we often refer to these as radicals. And so a character might have like, let's say 12 strokes or 15 strokes, but it may only be composed of 3 radicals. And so there are just a couple hundred radicals that compose the majority of like several thousand characters. And so while, when you look at a Chinese character kind of from a distance, if you're not writing them by hand, you're just typing or just trying to read, you definitely do notice similarities. Like, oh yeah, I've seen that before, I've seen this before. But in my experience, it takes an incredibly long time to really become aware of all those different pieces in every character. When you write Chinese characters by hand, it trains you to really become hyper aware and attentive to the way those characters are composed. And this allows you to constantly cross-reference as you're learning more characters, and you're like, oh yeah, okay, this is that radical, this is that one. These 2 characters are the same, except this one has the water radical on the left and this one has the person radical on the left. You really become very aware of how each character is composed, and so how each character is similar and different. And then I still believe in general that it really deepens the cognitive process and just helps you to learn to process these characters. You become able to write characters very quickly and very naturally, and I do believe that has an impact on how you're able to read them. I remember that I once had a roommate who did not like to write characters, and we once got the game Metal Gear Solid, if any of you know that, but we got it in Japanese, right? And so we would watch these like cinematic pieces between scenes, and I remember you'd have the Japanese subtitles at the bottom, and even though they were very small, I was able to recognize almost every time correctly, like, ooh, isn't that the character from this word? And my roommate, who didn't like to write, every time was like, nah, it looks different to me. And I would look in the dictionary and I would find almost 100% of the time it was correct, right? So even in subtitles on a big screen, they're pretty small, because I was handwriting all the time, I was very good at recognizing characters out of context. So my big piece of advice that I think is a little bit counterintuitive, and I don't personally hear a lot of people recommending this, I think you really have to trust your brain's ability to learn and assimilate information, and you have to actually learn like a lot of words and characters in a short time. Let me explain what I mean. So in university programs in the US, at least the one I was in, we were going to learn 100 Chinese characters or kanji per semester, which would give us 800 characters after a 4-year program. Now, 800 might sound like a lot, but you need to learn more than 2,000 for sort of daily use reading in Japanese. So not only is that going to take you forever to learn enough characters at that pace, but also I actually believe that learning characters more slowly, it doesn't necessarily mean you're going to learn each character better. I think it slows you down incredibly. So the counterintuitive part here is that I think the key, the secret is, don't necessarily focus on learning 10 characters, mastering the 10 characters, and then moving on to the next. Like in university, the way it was always done is like, hey, this week we have these 10 characters. You're gonna try to master these 10 the whole week or 2 weeks, and then we're gonna have an exam. And then it's like, cool, you have now mastered these 10 characters. Let's learn the next 10. I don't think it works that way. I think, in my opinion, what you want to do is really pour a ton of words and characters into your brain. And it doesn't mean that you're gonna have mastered all of them. But what's gonna happen is you're gonna start to see the same characters, the same radicals over and over and over again. And you're gonna be able to constantly cross-reference and learn by association, which is how the memory works. Because a lot of words in Japanese and Chinese, they're just composed of 2 Chinese characters. And so if you learn like shokuji in Japanese, then maybe you learn like washoku, and then you learn like shokudo, and you start to see like, oh wow, this word, this character for shoku, which is the same as like in taberu, oh, this same character occurred in all 3 words. But then there's like shokuji, right? And then maybe you see this ji in 4 other words, and then in shokudo you see do, and then you learn it. So the point is that if you learn enough words and enough characters in a short period of time, you're gonna be able to constantly cross-reference. And so, like I said, it doesn't mean that you're gonna master them in that short time, but I think in the long run, you will master them and you're gonna learn a lot more because you have this massive, massive boost in your brain's ability to learn information by associating. And so I found that with my students of Japanese, if I told them ahead of time, hey, we're gonna learn 600 characters, they would probably just run away from me. But in every case, I found that I was able to have my students learning like 500 or 600, 700 characters in a really short period of time. Again, it doesn't mean that they mastered every single one. It doesn't mean they could write all of them by hand perfectly, but they were aware of these characters. They were able to read vocabulary and words with those characters, and they could recognize all of them. So that's why I say, I think you have to just trust your brain's ability to really like assimilate and learn information through this constant cross-referencing and associating. And don't be tempted to try to master every character and learn them in a really slow pace. So Trilingual Lin, I hope this helps. These are just some tips that I've really helped me over the years. They helped all of my students. You don't have to write by hand. So the students who I had that refused to write characters by hand, they still learned Japanese in most cases. But seriously, the process was so much slower. But with those students, I still did sort of really pour all these words and all these characters onto them, and they still were able to learn them a lot more quickly than we did in university. Okay, that was a really difficult question to try to answer like on the fly with no preparation, so I hope it made sense, and I really hope you guys enjoyed it. Would love to get your thoughts in the comments. Happy Friday, have a great day, and I'll see you tomorrow.